Well, the United States has bombed Venezuela and kidnapped the president. This is happening amidst renewed threats to take over Greenland, to overthrow the governments of Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, and this is all part of what is known as the Donroe Doctrine of Donald Trump to try to exert U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. What does this mean for Canada? Welcome to the first episode of The Class Line. This is a new podcast put on by the Revolutionary Communist Party, and the goal of The Class Line is to uncover the class interests behind major events occurring in Canada. The capitalist system is in crisis, and people are looking for answers. They're looking for explanations, and they're looking for ways to fight back in this epoch of violence, war, and attacks on living conditions. And yes, the ruling class and the right wing have an interest in obscuring what is actually happening. And we have an interest in revealing the class line behind events to show what is actually happening, to assist the working class in Canada in its fight against the bosses, against the capitalist system. And in order to fight back, Frederick Engels, great Marxist, collaborated with Marx, said that the fight of the proletariat is not just political and economic, but is also ideological. In order to fight back, we must have the right ideas. And the left is weak. I think a lot of people are actually on the left are quite depressed about the state of things. But why is the left weak? The left is primarily weak ideologically, because it lacks the proper ideas to fight back. So the point of this podcast is to draw the class line, is to show the class line and provide a class-based analysis for events in Canada. And yes, I'm happy to have with me on the first episode, Marco La Grotta. We are going to discuss the events in Venezuela, the so-called Donroe Doctrine, and what that all means for Canada. So I guess to start off, maybe we can just start with what happened in Venezuela on January 3rd. Marco?
Yeah, I think probably a lot of people are already familiar with the details. But just to reiterate, so I think it was, just a week ago? Over a week ago. It seems like much longer. It's been Lenin talked about, weeks where decades happen. I think we're living through one of those periods. But, we had a really shocking operation, I guess you could say, involving something like 150 U.S. aircraft, helicopters, bombers, etc. That's in addition to the naval blockade that's been stationed outside of Venezuela. In the weeks leading up to it, something like 20% of the U.S. Navy was stationed on the coast of Venezuela, enforcing a blockade. But it was a nighttime operation, which, led to the kidnapping. And, the Canadian media has been really cautious not to use this word, kidnapping. But
I think they instructed the journalists not to use that word.
Which is insane, because I can't think of another word to describe what they did. They kidnapped the head of a sovereign state, kidnapped the head of Venezuela, shipped him off to New York City, where he's now on trial for drug trafficking, leading a gang which doesn't exist, which they've now admitted, pretty much since admitted to. Yeah,
they admitted officially that the Cartel de los Soles is fake.
Yeah,
so they made up the reason.
Completely trumped up charges. I mean, the narco trafficking charges are also patently ridiculous. I think we've discussed this before in our articles. Very little, if any, fentanyl or cocaine passes through Venezuela to the United States. The real reasons, in fact, we don't have to guess at the real reasons, because Trump, and if you like, it's one of the positive aspects of Trump, is that he's been quite honest about why they conducted this operation. He hasn't said it was for democracy. The Canadians are now playing this element up. We'll talk about that, how it was a victory for democracy. But Trump has not used that language. He's made it clear that this was an operation carried out to, in the first place, acquire the oil in Venezuela. He had a meeting just the other day with the big U.S. oil executives, which was essentially an auction block, if you like, to sort of sell off the assets of Venezuela for the benefit of U.S. companies. They've since announced a deal that they'll be shipping anywhere from 30 to 50 billion barrels of oil from Venezuela, which will now pass into the ownership of the United States. The United States will sell that oil on the market, and then it will be up to Trump himself how that money gets distributed. So essentially what you have is a situation where Venezuela has been reduced to a semi-colony or a protectorate of the United States. Trump is, if you like, the de facto leader of Venezuela at this moment in time. We have the oil. And then I would say the bigger reason behind this was, the Donroe Doctrine, pushing so-called non-hemispheric actors, namely Russia and China, which had a certain base in Venezuela in the last period, pushing them out of Venezuela. And again, Trump has been very clear about this, that part of the negotiations that they're having with the current government, Delcy Rodriguez, who was appointed by Maduro, we should add, is that Venezuela will essentially suspend trade with Russia, with China, push out any foreign actors of those countries, and essentially put Venezuela into a position where the U.S. is completely in control. And again, we don't have to guess at any of this. Trump has said it. So it makes our job a little bit easier, if you like. But it doesn't make it any less scandalous. So there's more we could say, but I think that's the situation.
Yeah, well, I think you said it all right there. Absolutely. When I think of this, absolutely scandalous. I've heard people say unprecedented, never happened before. I think actually we should be clear, this has happened before. Mm-hmm. The U.S. did pretty much this to Noriega. They've done this before in other countries. They've killed the head of state of other countries or assisted that. They've kidnapped Aristide in Haiti, if you remember, just when was that, 20 years ago? Something like that?
2004, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So this is not just a Trump thing. But there is a specific strategy that Trump is pushing with the Donroe Doctrine, which is, yes, focusing on reestablishing American dominance in the Western Hemisphere and pushing other powers out, and to a certain degree abandoning other places of the world where they do not feel is their natural national security interest. This helps explain why Trump has been a bit more cold. He's cold on Ukraine. He doesn't really want to get to do that. He's been kind of pushed into it. Anyway, we can get more into that a bit later. But in terms of let's just finish the point on Venezuela. Absolutely scandalous. Mm-hmm. We have other podcasts that go through more details about Venezuela. But just from the perspective of how this affects Canada, I think we should get into that. Mm-hmm. Because how has the Canadian government responded to this? Obviously, Carney is a defender of democracy and international law and the United Nations and the sovereignty of nations. He says that all the time, right? So you would think, faced with this, the Canadian government and Carney and Canadian politicians across the board who have not missed an opportunity to say that Russia has violated Ukrainian sovereignty, for example, would rush to Venezuela's defense and denounce this egregious violation of international law and the national sovereignty of another country. But actually, no. I'll quote what Carney has said. This is what they start. He starts his statement like this. One of the first actions taken by Canada's new government in March 2025 was to impose additional sanctions on Nicolas Maduro's brutally oppressive and criminal regime. unequivocally condemning his grave breaches of international peace and security, gross and systematic human rights violations, and corruption. Canada has not recognized the illegitimate regime of Maduro since it stole the 2018 election. Later on, it says, in keeping with our long-standing commitment to upholding the rule of law, sovereignty, and human rights, Canada calls on all parties to respect international law. Quite an incredible statement, considering what's happened. Actually, there are some key things missing from this statement, which is no mention of the bombing of Venezuela, no mention of the violation of sovereignty of Venezuela, no mention of the kidnapping of the head of state of Venezuela. So the statement it's been commented on in the mainstream media, is generally weak and hypocritical, cowardly, two-faced, is essentially claiming to stand up for certain principles while not standing up for them in practice. So, Anita Anand, the foreign minister of Foreign Affairs, essentially made a very similar statement. Pierre Poilievre, unsurprisingly, the leader of the Conservative Party, gave a full-throated down with socialism, long live freedom celebration of Trump's actions. Mm-hmm. But yeah, this has basically been the response from Canadian capitalist politicians. So yeah, what explains that? Why so hypocritical and cowardly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before I go into that, just to add that, they're really, when they say that Canada supports Venezuelan democracy, Canada, or I should say the Canadian state, has never supported Venezuelan democracy.
Nothing to do with that, yeah.
And in fact, if you go back to the period when Hugo Chavez was in power, and Chavez was, we should add, massively popular when he was in power, won many elections.
Dozens of elections, yeah.
A couple dozen elections or referendums. And at each stage, it was the Canadian state, obviously in alliance with the American government, trying to subvert democracy, supporting coup attempts against Chavez, supporting the anti-democratic attempts of the Venezuelan opposition, and trying to, in a word, overthrow Venezuelan democracy, because Hugo Chavez did not act in their interests at that time. So let's put that to one side. I mean, they're full of shit, essentially, when they make a comment like that. And they've never supported democracy anywhere in Latin America. You mentioned the example of Haiti. It's a more recent example. 2005, the Aristide government, which was a left-wing government, which Canada, again, in alliance with the US, worked together to essentially depose that government, which I think was Haiti's first elected government, at least in a very long time.
And Canada had troops on the ground. They secured the airport.
Yeah. So, like you said, from front to back, hypocrisy. So we have to make that clear first and foremost. The Canadian state is not the defender of democracy in the Americas, and neither is the United States. But also, okay, why though? That's obviously the million-dollar question. Why? And I would say part of the reason is because Canada, or I should say Canadian business and Canadian banks, have an interest in what's taking place in Latin America. And again, we don't have to guess at that. They've been saying these things quite openly. Actually, there was a comment the other day, which I know you're familiar with. I shared it on Facebook. It actually went a little bit viral. But this was a statement made by the CEO of Scotiabank, obviously one of the largest banks in Canada, who was speaking last week at it was a conference of bankers, essentially. So a lot of the other CEOs, executives of the big banks were at this meeting. And I'll just read the quote from Bloomberg. This is the comments he made at that meeting. And he's commenting, so this is after Maduro was kidnapped, and he was essentially offering his opinion, what this means for business in Canada. And this is his quote. He says, "Longer term, this is a good thing for the Western Hemisphere. It's a good thing for the US. It's a good thing for the Bank of Nova Scotia." And then it goes on, Thompson, that's the CEO, said political movements toward the right or center-right in countries including Chile, Colombia, and Peru, along with what he called a very business-friendly administration in Mexico, are supportive of stronger growth. This trend should benefit Scotiabank over the next several years. And then it goes on. He also pointed to the so-called Trump Doctrine, so the Donroe Doctrine, a modern take on the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, outlined in a national security strategy late last year, as another factor he views as favorable for growth. And of course, yeah, they talk about growth, but in fact, what they're talking about is their profits.
Yeah.
That this is good for Canadian business. The reason being, Canadian banks, as well as Canadian mining companies, have significant exposure and significant assets all throughout Latin America. I have some more figures here. Maybe we can get into them later. But significant mining assets in places like Cuba, which is another one of the countries that Trump has mentioned, is in his crosshairs.
He said it's about to fall. That's what he said.
But also countries like Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and so on. And obviously what they're saying here, and again, it's one of those rare moments where you get an honest statement from the bourgeoisie, from the horse's mouth, if you like, that yes, the overthrow of these, left-wing governments, even though, many of them were very weak left-wing governments, would be very much in the interests of Canada, because it would essentially carve out new markets for the banks, new mining opportunities, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it wouldn't be very much to the benefit of the people of Latin America, but it'd be very much to the benefit of these big corporations. Essentially, what you have is, with Canada, they're almost like vultures, you could say. They kind of are like the younger brother, if you like, to the United States. They let their big brother do the dirty work. They overthrow the governments. They send the troops in. They send the Navy in, take out these governments, put in puppet regimes. And then the Canadians kind of swoop in after the fact to kind of pick up whatever scraps are left over. So this is essentially what's happening here. That's what this statement from the Scotiabank CEO means. It's good for business. It's good for their profits. And I think this is one of the main reasons.
Yeah, so I think this gets to the heart of what Canadian imperialism is. I saw a lot of people after Trump did what they did in Venezuela, were saying, oh no, Canada's next, because he's threatened to make Canada, he said he wanted to make Canada the 51st state, right? He said that. So a lot of people in Canada have, scared about that. This is actually why Mark Carney was elected, because he said elbows up and we all got to be strong together and resist Donald Trump. And I think some people have fearmongered that, Donald Trump's going to make Canada a colony like Venezuela. Now, I just want to say here that I don't think that is the real relationship between Canada and America. Canada, the Canadian ruling class, is not weak. They're strong. They're one of the main imperialist ruling classes in the world. And Canada has been a stable imperialist ally to America, actually intertwined with. And this gets to the kind of what you were saying. Canada is an imperialist power, but it doesn't actually usually defend its own interests. It relies on America and other NATO powers sometimes to defend its interests. And now that there is a push, or what's the way to put it, the relative decline of American imperialism, Canadian companies seek to lose out. And actually, you're seeing that a little bit. We mentioned this in previous podcasts in West Africa, where the Mali government is actually kind of a pro-Russia government, actually. It's not a pro-France. It was pro-France, pro-Western. And Canadian mining companies have, like Barrick Gold, have lost out there. And so I think they see this as what's happening in Latin America. They said, oh, wow. Well, yeah, if you just threaten, bully, overthrow governments that don't want to do business in Latin America, maybe that means we can do our business there and have a stable business environment, like they have throughout a large part of the 20th century, to be honest. It was America would stabilize things politically, and then Canadian companies would get some business. And that's the real relationship. So related to that, I think there's an issue that we should maybe talk about is, it's not that Trump is not going to he's going to get some concessions from Canada. So it's not that Canada is going to continue going on as the way it always has. Things are changing. And Carney, in relation to his statement that he made, why was it so hypocritical and cowardly? Well, it's also helps us answer the question, why, when Carney promised to fight against Trump, has he been capitulating all along the line? He dropped the counter tariffs on most things. They eliminated the digital service tax after Trump threw a hissy fit. He's backed off on so many things all along the line. They've capitulated to Trump's military spending demands, the border security demands, the demands on a whole bunch of stuff. They've basically capitulated to. And I think this gets the point. If you look at the history of Canadian capitalism, it does not exist without American capitalism. And politics, Lenin said, politics are concentrated economics. So at the end of the day, things have to have an economic justification. And so the Canadian government, as trying to represent these progressive values, is forced, because of economic reasons, to abandon them or not really defend them. They have to they're renegotiating this USMCA trade agreement, which the American administration has said they want Canadian manufacturing jobs to be moved to America. Some of them have already started to be moved to America. We got Stellantis plant, GM Cami plant. We've talked about that. And then you have they're not talking about loosening supply management, which is a Canadian state thing that protects dairy farmers, mostly in Quebec, but also in other places in the country. So this would allow American dairy farmers to more easily sell more of their milk and cheese and stuff in Canada. We'll see. Maybe they'll have to do that. But I think the point is here that the Trump doctrine is enough of this international collaboration in that sense. We'll defend American interests of American companies. You defend the interests of Canadian companies. And then also, might means right. Because we're the big, strong one, we get to determine the main policy. The Canadian government is not going to stand up to them on Venezuela. And they're not, Carney's made statements about Greenland, but is he really going to, what if Trump did the same thing to Greenland? It's highly unlikely that Carney would do anything. Or actually, to be frank, would be able to do anything. So this is the real relations between the U.S. imperialism and Canada, which is essentially, as we've described, the junior partner, the partner in crime of American imperialism. And ultimately, they can't piss off U.S. imperialism. They have to... Canadian capitalism cannot exist without American capitalism. They have to do a deal with them. They have to try to get a better deal, something, you know what I mean? I don't know if you have any more thoughts about that.
Well, just to echo that, because, this is the other side to Carney's, weak sauce statement, is that they're very nervous about the USMCA, the NAFTA, essentially, renegotiations. Because, if the tariffs don't come down, or God forbid from their perspective, new tariffs go up, that's going to be a total disaster for the Canadian economy, which, still to this day, despite all of the elbows up rhetoric, the overwhelming majority, 75% of the exports go to the United States. With oil, that's 90% going to the United States. They need those negotiations to go well. So they don't want to say anything that's going to upset Trump in any way, shape, or form. They need to kiss the ring. And just to say, because, Trump and the administration in the U.S. made all kinds of comments about Greenland and Colombia, Mexico, Cuba. They didn't mention Canada this time around. Although I would say that they still, their sights for Canada are still more or less the same, which, I would agree. It's not necessarily outright invasion. But deindustrialization, if you want to put it that way, bringing the auto jobs, bringing jobs in lumber and in other industries from Canada into the United States. there was actually a tweet. There was actually two tweets, but from Katie Miller, who is the wife of Stephen Miller.
Yeah.
Who, apparently she's a personality on Twitter. But she made a post after the operation in Venezuela with a essentially map of Greenland with the United States flag superimposed over top it.
Yeah.
And then it just said, soon.
Yeah.
Which kind of gives you a hint of where they're going. But around the same time, she also made a post about Canada, which got a bit less coverage. But I took the quote down. She said, "The U.S. doesn't need anything from Canada. Free trade is over." So, okay, maybe not outright invasion, but it shows you they still have a certain agenda for Canada. And Carney's fully aware of that, and they're very nervous about that. Yeah. So I think that also helps explain why the government is taking the approach that it has on Venezuela.
On that, Katie Miller's a horrible reactionary, but she is kind of letting people know what the real agenda is here. I would disagree with her, though. There are some things that the U.S. economy does rely on Canada for, and actually it helps us understand the Venezuela thing. One of those things is heavy crude, which comes from Alberta, which is not. It's a special type of oil used for specific things, and it's different than a lot of the oil that they produce in America. Now, the interesting thing about Venezuela is this is exactly the same type of oil produced in Venezuela. Also, almost simultaneously, last December, Donald Trump did a deal with Belarus. The reason why this is significant, they had sanctions on Belarus because Belarus is too close to Russia. Belarus is the second biggest producer of potash, which is used for agricultural purposes. Who's the first biggest producer? Canada, actually. And the U.S. currently buys, I think, 95% of its potash from Canada. So there are some things that the U.S. relies, but it seems like the U.S. is pivoting to make them less reliant on Canada to gain more leverage in the trade. And then these types of statements are to the effect to kind of try to claim leverage for the trade negotiations. So that's an interesting element of the Venezuela thing, that America is trying to get some leverage in the trade negotiations, I think, against Canada, so they can, and it's connected to this. Maybe we can go right into the Donroe Doctrine thing, but it's connected to just last November. If you didn't read it, you should. It's not that long, but the United States National Security Strategy document, which usually every single administration puts one out. It's usually extremely boring and not that interesting. This one is like a complete, it's a lightning bolt. It just comes out of... I think for a lot of people it came out of nowhere. I think if you've been paying attention to Trump and not just thinking he's crazy, there is a logic behind what he's doing. There is a strategy, actually, behind the Trump people's actions. And this document really sums it all up. Connected to what you said about Katie Miller, I believe it was the State Department that shared the graphic of Trump straddling the American continent with a bat that said Donroe Doctrine. So that sort of summarizes the national security strategy of the Trump people. But do you want to maybe say a bit more about what's the Donroe Doctrine, I guess, or what's the national security strategy of the America, and then we can talk about what that means for Canada.
Well, just to say one thing before going into that on the question of oil, that Canada also might be shooting itself in the foot in this respect. Because, like you said, the crude that comes from Venezuela is almost of the exact same quality that comes from Alberta, that comes from the oil sands. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but, until recently, Venezuela was a much larger supplier of oil to the United States than was Canada. In fact, a lot of the infrastructure, the pipeline infrastructure, the refining capacity in the United States wasn't built to import oil from Canada so much as it was built to import oil from Venezuela. Yeah,
the refineries are in like Texas and Louisiana and stuff, so they can get just across the Gulf.
So now that's changed in the last few years because of the sanctions imposed by the U.S. I think at its height, Venezuela was producing something like 3.5 million barrels of oil a day.
Yeah, like 20 years ago or something.
Yeah. That's since fallen because of the sanctions and other things. But just to put this into perspective, because let's say that oil does go back online. Let's say Trump gets what he wants. The U.S. oil companies pile in. They're able to sort of jumpstart production. Obviously, it's a big if, but let's say that happens. Canada at present exports about 4 million barrels of oil a day to the United States. Again, Venezuela in the past was producing 3.5 million. So even if they just, forget expanding production, even if they just get production to the levels that it was previously, that puts a very serious question mark over the Canadian oil.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, it's more complicated than that. Most of that oil from Venezuela would be going to the Gulf. Canadian oil, only about 10%, from what I understand, goes through the refiners in the Gulf Coast. But regardless, this will have an impact on the price of oil. It'll have a dramatic impact, in particular in Alberta. How big an impact, we don't know. But again, this will have consequences. The idea that this is, to the benefit of the Canadian people, I think that's not the case at all. In fact, it could have quite serious ramifications for the Canadian economy. So we'll have to see how that plays out. It's an added feature. But yeah, you mentioned about the
Donroe
Doctrine, and I think there's a lot to say. But I think what this represents is, the U.S. wants to be the master in its own house, if you want to put it that way. That increasingly, the world is being divided into a number of spheres of influences, which are being openly recognized by people like Trump, by people like Putin. The U.S. considers, in line with the Donroe Doctrine, the Americas as its traditional sphere of influence. And it's looking to assert control, starting with Venezuela. And I would say one more feature of the kidnapping of Maduro is also to send a message to the other governments in Latin America.
Sends a very strong message.
A very strong message, which is, to quote directly Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, fuck around and find out. That's what he said in the press conference. That's the kind of message they're sending to Colombia, to Cuba, and beyond. And it's had an effect. I mean, we were talking the other day that Petro, leader of Colombia, was on the phone and apparently had a very pleasant conversation, which I would add is very different from what he's saying to the Colombian people. Which
he's saying arm yourself.
Calling them a pedophile cult and other things like that in public, for domestic consumption, if you like. But then obviously behind the scenes is entering into negotiations, because the reality is that Colombia is a weak power, and it can't stand up to the might of the United States military. So this has been the effect. It's sent quite a ripple, you could say, throughout Latin America. And the main target at the moment seems to be Greenland, which obviously has the added complication that Greenland is, at the moment, dominated by Denmark. Right? Which essentially Greenland is a colony, you could say, of Denmark, which often doesn't get mentioned in the Western press. The Danes are kind of presented as these magnanimous rulers over the people of Greenland, which anyone who's read on the history of Greenland will know that's absolutely false. I mean, that's a separate discussion. But of course, the problem here is that Denmark is a NATO country, and the U.S. is a NATO country. So what this would mean if the U.S. were to actually go for Greenland, essentially a conflict or even a war between two NATO countries, which I would say this is completely unprecedented.
Yeah.
This is kind of a, if you like, a unique feature of Trump.
Well, there's a clause, I think it's Section 5, that if any NATO country is attacked, then they evoke Section 5, and then the other ones have to aid them and defend them. That's the whole point of NATO. It's a military alliance. So if Greenland is attacked by the United States and Denmark evokes Section 5, so this is the thing. I think if the United States uses military action against Greenland, NATO's dead. Because If they don't use Section 5, then what's the point of NATO? If they do, it's not enforceable. And it will be very clear for all to see that it's not enforceable. So, yeah, that's essentially... NATO's been dying for a while, but that would be,
final
Trump's
nail in the coffin.
Yeah, it would be. Because if you look at it, NATO is a security infrastructure agreement alliance established during the Cold War, after World War II. And it was expanded after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They brought in a lot of Eastern Bloc countries, even though they said they were never going to do that. They did. And the whole Ukraine conflict is directly related to this. They promised them NATO membership. But this infrastructure doesn't actually suit the Donroe Doctrine.
Yeah.
It's an old agreement. It doesn't make sense for the Donroe Doctrine. So what you're having is that old security infrastructure clash with these new economic power blocks that are competing. So, and Trump, he doesn't care about that.
No.
He clearly doesn't. He doesn't give a crap. So that's in his personality. He doesn't care about agreements that don't make sense in the current moment, right? So,
and maybe just to add, to make sense of why he wants Greenland. Obviously, it's a much bigger discussion, but I would say there's two primary reasons. One is access to critical minerals, of which Greenland has an abundant deposit of
loads,
a variety of different critical minerals. So I think that's one element of it. In fact, again, a separate point, but Canada actually has a large number of the concessions for mining in Greenland. So there's also an interest that if the U.S. were to take over Greenland or take effective control
Canadian
over
mining
Greenland,
companies would be salivating.
Yeah, Canadian mining companies might get a little bump from that as well. So that's something to take into account. But the second is the geostrategic position of Greenland, that, the Arctic is becoming a critical point of conflict between the United States, Russia, and China. And it has importance to the United States from a military perspective. And the fact is that at the present moment in time, Greenland is a big, you can say, sort of opening or a weak spot of the United States defense umbrella. I was reading an article that they have a base, the United States, which is essentially a radar station in Greenland, but it's exposed. They were saying all it would take is a single hypersonic missile, which Russia possesses. They've actually used it. That was in the news a few weeks ago, and the U.S. is not currently in a position to shoot it down, to defend its installation, which also explains why they're so upset with the Europeans, because the fact is that NATO has not developed the military presence in Greenland to Trump's satisfaction. In fact, NATO, actually, I didn't know this, but they don't even have a Northern Command or an Arctic Command.
Right,
It's kind of been a blind spot for them. Trump the other day, he was firing some barbs against Denmark. He said, they've neglected the military buildup. He says, you know what Denmark's military buildup in Greenland is? He said, 2 dog sleds. That's, the Danish military presence in Greenland. Obviously, he's exaggerating. But the point is that the U.S. does not consider what Europe and NATO is doing sufficient, which helps explain, listen, if you're not going to do it, then we are going to do it. So I think, it's not just Trump is a narcissist or Trump is mad. There is a method to the madness as well. And obviously we'll have to see how that plays out.
So the national security strategy document that I mentioned that they put out last November, that kind of explains the strategy. I'll quote it here. He says, the document says that they reject the ill-fated concept of global domination for itself, meaning America. So basically, they're basically saying this is also why they don't care much for NATO, the United Nations, or international law. They're like, no, because actually, if you didn't know, the United Nations is the baby of America. It was created by United States, and things like international law were used by the United States to justify their domination of the world. They didn't have to abide by the law. They violated it left, right, and center. If they couldn't get the United Nations to sanction a war or something that they were going to do, they did it anyway. Everyone remembers Iraq War, Coalition of the Willing, Well, If you're too young,
Well,
you
not
might
everyone.
not you might not remember that. But yeah, this setup was to justify the U.S.'s unipolar domination. That's what it was, especially after the Soviet Union collapsed and China was brought into the capitalist market in the 90s. The U.S. was the only power actually in the world. And so, this national security document is basically, now it's admitting there are other powers. They've said this many times. There's a multipolar world. Marco Rubio said it. Trump said it. And we have to they have to recognize that. So they reject the ill-fated concept of global domination. And their aim is to, quote, restore American preeminence in the Western hemisphere. Now, this is something about perspectives, a point about perspectives I wanted to make here quickly. The Revolutionary Communist International, of what we are a part of, we have been talking about this for over a year now, actually, that there is a method to the madness of the Trump people, that there is a need for the, I don't know, call it what you will, the political, military, security question to come into alignment with the new balance of power in the world, and which there are other powers other than America, mainly China. We'll get into that in a minute. So yeah, this national security strategy document explains they're going to reject world domination, focus on the Western hemisphere. Why? And they talk about, we already mentioned it, kicking out non-hemispheric powers. Who are they referring to? Mainly China, to be frank. China in South America, South American countries, China is the main trading partner for them. Trump's complained about this. He said, well, what have the previous administrations been sleeping at the wheel, basically? There's a certain truth to that. So this helps explain Greenland, Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, these comments that they're making. This is the aim that they're trying to make. In that document, they mentioned something called enlist and expand, I believe it's called, or enlist and enlarge, whatever. You get the idea. And in that, enlist, I believe, basically applies to Canada. Enlist key allies in the region. So who agree, they basically use pressure to get them to agree on immigration, on drugs, on whatever, and then they enlist them to help them with certain projects. Their project here in critical minerals or whatever it is. That's essentially what's happening. So yeah, this is the national security strategy. You mentioned Katie Miller. Well, I wanted to quote her husband, Stephen Miller, who's a total reactionary bastard, a racist, anti-immigrant, imperialist warmonger. And he was on the news the other day, CNN, with Jake Trapper, CNN journalist host guy, and who interviewed him. And a lot of people were very shocked by his comments because what he said, in response to the comments about Greenland and what they did in Venezuela, he said this, he said, we live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. A lot of liberals, even some people on the left, I saw freaking out about this, being like, whoa, no, that's unacceptable. But actually, he is right. And this is not new, as I mentioned. This was always true. The U.S. always used its power and might and economy to get their way, even when they said it was for democracy or they said it was for human rights or sovereignty or whatever. They essentially were exercising their economic interests, their strength, their power, and they were using that to get their way. He also says this. He says, we're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. So yeah, this is essentially them pulling the mask off things.
Yeah.
They're saying, in a sense, Trump has done us a favor because why did they do what they did in Venezuela? Democracy? Something like that? No, oil. He says it's for the oil. You don't need to, it's for pure economic reasons. So yeah, this helps us understand a little bit about what this Donroe Doctrine is. It's, they moved the bulk of their fleet now into the Western Hemisphere. They moved it out of the Mediterranean. What they're going to do with it, what comes next, we'll see. But it's going to be connected to this general strategy. And I guess, anyway, do you have anything you want to add
just
on
one
here,
thing to add about how this relates to Canada as well.
Yeah,
because,
I wanted to
you
move on to
mentioned
that,
Yeah, and was it enlist and expand?
Enlist and expand, yes.
Because the question's been thrown around since the kidnapping of Maduro. Is Canada next? I've had a number of people.
I saw a meme
ask me
saying
that.
Carney changes his Google location. It's like, or like the president of an oil-rich country. It's like Carney's like, oh no.
You can run, but you can't hide.
Yeah, essentially.
But on that point, to be serious, is that question: Will the U.S. invade Canada? And to that, I would say, why would they need to?
They don't.
Why would they need to? Because the fact is, with the present government, with the Carney government, the U.S. Trump is getting every last thing that they've demanded of the Canadians. And you mentioned a few of them before. 5% defense spending. He got that.
Yeah.
More Border Patrol officers.
Yeah.
He got that. They pulled back on the tariffs. Right?
Yeah.
They had the option to retaliate with the recent round, and they decided we're not going to do it. Participation in the Golden Dome.
Yeah.
This missile defense system. There's strong suggestions that Carney's going to participate in that. Every last thing that they've asked for, the Canadian government has conceded. Yeah, all of this talk of elbows up aside, on every fundamental point, they've conceded to the regime in the United States, which is, different from what you have in Greenland. In Greenland, Trump feels that the Europeans, NATO, are dragging their feet, which is why he's, I guess, amped up the threats and the talks of invasion. They don't need to do that in Canada. They've got a willing participant. Yeah, we use the term junior partner. We've used the analogy also of, the master and his butler.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. So why would they need to invade Canada? In fact, probably don't have the time to go into it here, but there's a long history of U.S. threats to invade Canada, going all the way back to the American Revolution, the end of the 1700s. But the fact is, every time that the U.S. threatened to invade Canada, they ended up not going through with it. Not because they couldn't do it. The U.S. could have easily, at many points, taken over Canada quite easily. But they refrained from doing so. Why? Because they didn't need to. Because they usually signed a deal, and the Americans got every last thing that they wanted from Canada. And we're seeing the same process play out today. So I think, it's not realistic. Obviously, never say never. Things could change. But no, Trump is getting everything he wants from the Carney government. So this is a fundamental feature, I would say.
Yeah, in many ways, I think Canada acts as almost the lawyer for America, or the left cover, It kind of gives a different justification. America is more brutal. It's kind of like good cop, bad cop almost. They both part of the same imperialist bloc. This change will affect, let me put it this way, Canadian businesses seem to be, in mining and banking and things, seem to be kind of happy about this. Actually, another one that they've walked back on, environmental stuff. They're happy they can do away with the Trudeau-era environmental policies. They all of the Canadian banks exited this zero-emission alliance that Carney himself was the one who created. So they're happy about this. They can get rid of this woke stuff, get rid of the environmental stuff, just focus on profit. Oh, and then they're going to overthrow a government. We can do business there. They're happy. But this is where I'm saying, what does it mean for Canada? Well, Canada, what is the class line? Canada is a capitalist country. For capitalists, they're going to find a way to break bread with the American ruling class and be a junior partner in their conquests. And they will be totally happy to sacrifice Canadian workers. For Canadian working class people, it's a completely different question. They'll be tossed by the wayside. They'll be sacrificed. Many of them are already being laid off and sacrificed. They're being laid off by Canadian capitalists who are choosing to move their money into the U.S. I think this is the class line here, is that it's not Canada against America, right? It's not like that. It's Western imperialist bloc. Canada's an ally, a junior partner, a butler, whatever you want to say, of America. And they're willing to, with everything shifting with this Donroe Doctrine, they're willing to sacrifice. And Carney's already indicating that. They're going to be big we predict this. There'll be big cuts to social spending, not just at the federal level, at the provincial level. It's already happening all over the country. There'll be a tax on the right to strike, which is already happening, a tax on the trade unions, and a tax on the living conditions of working class people. So we don't gain anything by uniting with our ruling class and our government, who pretend to oppose American imperialism when they ultimately don't. Related to that, the Donroe Doctrine is clearly, Trump said it the other day. I think you watched that interview where he basically says he doesn't believe in international law. Did you watch it?
I saw the clip.
Oh, you saw the clip. But yeah, he basically says, I don't need international law. I have my own morality that I go by. So yeah, this blatant attack on Venezuela, even the fact that Maduro's being tried in an American court, he's not an American citizen. He's not beholden to American law. This is all quite ridiculous, obviously. But I've seen a lot of people sort of go, but we need to, Canada should upstand international law. We should all kind of defend this United Nations declaration on XYZ or something like that. What's the communist approach to this, I guess? Do we just run around defending international law? Do you want to say a few things about that?
Well, I mean, I think we can, quote Lenin on this, because, Lenin, the United Nations didn't exist during Lenin's time, but the League of Nations did, which was, called the predecessor to the United Nations. And Lenin's opinion on the League of Nations was this. He called it a den of thieves, right? That it was essentially a screen, if you like, to act as a cover for the interests of the big imperialist powers. And that's exactly the role that an organization like the United Nations and this whole idea of international law plays. Yeah, Alan Woods, who's one of our leading members in Britain, he often makes the point, they talk about an international rules-based order. But no one ever wrote down these rules.
Yeah.
There's not a document that you can pull up
and
you can read read the rules. The fact is, what it represented was, whatever happened to be the interests of the United States at a given point in time. And yes, sometimes they would operate through the UN. And when there was an obstacle there, they just do it themselves, unilaterally, whether that was going to war, whether that was introducing sanctions, and so on and so forth. It's an absolute joke. The United Nations has failed to stop a single war. Actually, let's use a recent example. We had the genocide in Gaza.
That's the most flagrant example.
Yeah, and
of course, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations resolutions, the whatever,
Yeah, and there's a lot of tough talk, if you like, from the Secretary General, from lawyers, and South Africa launched a case against Israel through the International Criminal Court. And what came of it? It didn't dent Israel's actions in Gaza one bit. It didn't stop them one bit. Because it's really an illusion at the end of the day. Like you said, it's a screen to allow the big imperialist powers to continue as they were. This is not a solution to the problem. I would also add the idea of multipolarity is also
it's a very important point,
not a solution, because and by multipolarity, for those who aren't familiar, this whole idea that actually the world breaking up into different spheres of influence is a good thing for countries like Venezuela. And in fact, this was an idea that was put forward by Maduro and was put forward by Delcy Rodriguez. This whole idea that, okay, now we've got an American sphere, a Chinese sphere, and a Russian sphere. And this is good because we can now balance off of the powers a little bit. And kind of, okay, if the U.S. is coming on a bit too strong, we'll do more business with China. We'll do more business with Russia. It's worth asking, what came of that? Use Russia as an example. Russia was, for years talking about its close ties with Maduro and, all kinds of the everlasting friendship between Russia and Venezuela and so on and so forth. What was Russia's response to the abduction of Maduro? Actually, at least the last I checked, I could be wrong, but Putin, to this day, has not even commented on the kidnapping of Maduro by the United States. Russia did not lift a finger to protect Maduro. In fact, one of the points that I was reading in an article today, I think the New York Times, they were talking about these Russian air defense systems. That part of the reason that they didn't function, that they weren't defending Venezuela.
There was helicopters flying right over Caracas. There was nothing.
Part of the reason apparently is because the Venezuelan army didn't have the expertise to operate some of them. They required, in order to operate, Russian technicians and Russian military operatives in order to teach them how to actually use the air defense system. But apparently Russia neglected to do that, either because they didn't consider it that important. There's also suggestions that, they were worried that it could lead to a conflict between Russia and the United States if you have, Russian troops on the ground, if they get pulled into a conflict. The point being that when push came to shove, despite all of this talk about the friendship between Putin and Maduro and Putin and Venezuela, Russia did not lift a finger to defend them. We have to look at things like that. When you have people advancing this idea of, multipolarity, that's the way forward for nations like Venezuela. It didn't help Venezuela in this point. This is not a solution. So I think we also have to point that out.
Yeah, well, there are more conflicts around the world than there are the most conflicts around the world right now since World War II. Actually, I think there's 80 active conflicts. It's partially a product of multipolarity. It's partially a product of the fact that there are competing imperialist powers that are supporting the civil war in Sudan's like this. There are different sides, and there are different imperialists that get their money in there to support different sides. Actually, Canadian military equipment is being used in that war. What do we think about that? We don't... Look... Someone's going to say, oh, so you support U.S. unipolar dominance. No, I don't. We are communists. Mm-hmm. We are communists. Unipolar dominance of America was horrible. They just did whatever they want. You had gunboat diplomacy, kind of like what they do with Venezuela, but all over the world. But yeah, having multiple capitalist powers with different spheres of influence fight over the world mm-hmm. is not better.
No.
It's just another form of imperialism. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what we have now. And there's going to be a lot more war, more conflict, more bombing, more things like we saw in Venezuela because, as we mentioned, the security military infrastructure has to be brought into congruence with the economic power mm-hmm. and trade relations. And Donald Trump is going to try to force those things violently in that direction. Actually, the message this sends to other powers is that the Russia was entirely justified in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. That's what it sends. That's the message it sends. Mm-hmm. And it also sends the message that China, if they want, has a very good justification and claim to Taiwan. Mm-hmm. So watch what happens. I think something like that is likely. So you have these different major powers that are fighting for their own interests. And that's actually just, if you read Lenin's book on imperialism, that's basically what he describes. Mm-hmm. He doesn't just talk about one setup. He talks about you can have multiple setups where different powers rise and fall based on their economic might, and they fight against each other. And that all comes back to capitalism. And that's ultimately what we're talking about here. And I know a lot of people, they see these events and they get scared. Mm-hmm. And they're worried because they can see the world changing. It's not changing in a good way. So what do we think about that? What is the way to fight back against imperialism, to fight back against all this stuff that's happening? Yes, you want to maybe start on that?
Well, I mean, it's, genuine internationalism, and I think we can actually quote Chavez on this. There's a fantastic quote. I might be paraphrasing, not have it exactly, but, Chavez used to be asked the question from people abroad in the West who supported the Bolivarian Revolution. And they asked him, they said, how can we best support you? How can we best support the Bolivarian Revolution? And, maybe they were expecting him to say, charity, give us money, whatever. But that's not what Chavez said. He said, if you want to support the Bolivarian Revolution, there's a simple answer. make revolution at home. Make revolution in your own country. Because the fact is, it's powers like Canada, it's powers like the United States and others who are the reason why, all of these countries are held in subjection. Why their resources are plundered, why their people are poor. It's because of the actions of imperialist governments, primarily in the West. The way to beat that is to fight the government, to fight these imperialist governments here at home. And the two struggles are very much linked because, I'd echo what you said before. How do Canadian workers, or American workers for that matter, benefit from what's taking place in Venezuela?
Yeah,
they don't benefit in any way, shape, or form. The banks will benefit. Yeah, so the CEO of Scotiabank, he's going to make a killing. The banks in Canada, I can't remember the exact figure, but last year the profits were estimated at something like $40 to $50 billion.
Record profits, yeah.
But you and I aren't going to see any of that. That goes right into their pockets, This is not in the interests of ordinary Canadian workers. There's nothing we benefit. In fact, there's a lot that we lose. Think of all this money that's going into the war machine, to overthrow governments halfway around the world. That's our taxpayer dollars. That's coming out of our pocket. We're paying for it, but we're not getting any benefit out of it. And then, you have the suffering of, millions of people around the world. We have every interest in linking up with the struggle of people in these countries. A united struggle against imperialism. Right? That's genuine internationalism.
Yeah, I think that sums it up. I mean, it's kind of a well-known aphorism of Marx, workers of the world unite. Workers of the world unite. And here it is. We're talking about, this is the first episode of the class line. What is the class line? It's not Canada versus America or America versus Venezuela or the bourgeoisie, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast, always tries to obscure things. I've seen a lot of people say things like this about Venezuela. Oh, but Maduro was a dictator and we need to XYZ and XYZ. And it's like, get back to this. How does the working class benefit from this? Mm-hmm. Does not benefit, not the workers of Canada and definitely not the workers of Venezuela. And so, what we seek to do with this podcast is to show that class line, to show how the class interests at root are what is driving this conflict. This is what we defend. We defend genuine internationalism. Mm-hmm. The workers of Canada, workers of America, workers of Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, the entire Americas must fight against this, must fight against imperialism. And we don't appeal back to the rules-based order, which was quite horrible for most people in most countries in the world. Mm-hmm. We're not liberals. We shouldn't be. I've seen people say, oh, how come the left is the only one that defends the rules-based order? I'm like, if that's the case, that's really bad. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact that the capitalists, the conservatives, the liberals, the Trumpians have all abandoned the rules-based order in practice, in words, some of them still support it, doesn't mean that the left still needs to support that. Is that we need to, fight for the working class. And that's where real power. So I would take what Stephen Miller said and actually say, that is true. Mm-hmm. It is real power that what decides. And so how do you can say, we can take Greenland, you're not going to fight us. No one's going to fight us over Greenland. I'm like, the working class of America is a sizable working class, and it has revolutionary traditions. Mm-hmm. And same thing with the working class in Canada has revolutionary traditions. It's our goal to revive those traditions, because that's actually the only force that can really fight against imperialism. It's the working class. That is the class line here. When we're talking about the Donroe Doctrine, that is the class line on the question of Venezuela. And that is the class line that's going to help us understand what left-wingers, what communists in Canada can do today. So if you like this podcast, this is a new podcast, I guess there's a few things you can help us. Follow us. Share the podcast, rate us. Please rate us 5 out of 5 or whatever. This all helps to boost the podcast. I want to get right out of the gate, just spreading this far and wide. Share it with friends, family, people that you think will enjoy it. Help us really boost this on Spotify, on YouTube. Also, we want to make this engaging. So comment. please comment on the podcast, comment on the YouTube channel. Maybe if there's specific questions that you want us to address, that will give us good ideas of what type of podcast episodes to get out there. Or you just want to make a little comment about something, that's more than welcome. You can either email us, we'll leave an email in the notes, in the show notes, in the description, or you could just make a comment on the YouTube or the Spotify about, whatever, just a random thought that you had. We'll either potentially read it out on the podcast or put it in Communist Revolution, our monthly newspaper, or put it on our website, marxist.ca. So yes, here's all the ways that you can help us really make this podcast a success. So yes, this is the Class Line. This is our first episode, and please help us make it a success.